tuning into The Last Page, where we read books by local authors and then get to discuss them with the author. Today's book is Merch Table Blues. I'm Around Spitzer for the discussion. We also have Andy Velez, our News 8 producer, and Kendra Simpson, a reporter here, and of course, Peter Connors, the author. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Well, let's start off. What is the book about?
So I call it a sex, drugs, and rock and roll murder mystery. And really the idea of the book is, what if a band with a cult following was actually being followed by a cult? And so there's murders along the way, and you need to figure out who did it, and you meet all the band members, and you go through some different musical scenes and things like that. So it's just a lot of fun.
Yeah, no, we had a lot of fun reading it and found it interesting and really tried not to discuss the book. In fact, we had to stop ourselves from discussing the book multiple times. I found the relationship between Virgil and Richard really interesting and kind of confusing, I have to say, right? There's loyalty, dependence, rivalry, admiration. Yeah. So what was your goal with that relationship?
You know, it's interesting that you picked up on that. One of the things that I wanted to do with that was to explore male relationships, male friendships. And so they have a very long friendship that is almost like a brotherhood, you know. They're more like brothers because they've been friends through growing up. And I go in the book back through their childhood some and talk about different episodes of their life growing up together. But those things are always complicated, you know. There's very little, there's very few things that are just black and white like that. So, you know, Virgil loves Richard, Richard loves Virgil, but also, you know, Richard is kind of maddening and frustrating and an egomaniac and all this stuff. Yep. And, you know, Virgil needs to be more assertive and things like that. And so they challenge each other in that way. And I think it's to me, it was fun to examine the male friendship part of the book.
I think it's interesting because there were parts where I was asking myself, is Virgil in love with Richard? Right. Because I don't know if anyone else got that feeling, but I was like, because it almost felt like the admiration and everything from him, it was like almost he was infatuated with Richard to the point that it was like, oh, is he also kind of in love? Because they hint that Julius, you hint at the fact that Julius seems to be in love with Richard or interested in him. So I was like, oh, is this another possibility, or is it just like loves him like a brother?
Yeah. Well, I think, you know, one of the things with that is that Richard is a rock star, and he's extremely charismatic. He's a magnetic personality, and I think with people like that, sometimes things can get a little like, you know, he does admire him, and he's almost like a mythological figure because he's got so much charisma, because he's up on stage entertaining people and he carries that energy with him. So I think there is that sort of love and like admiration that doesn't cross over into a romantic love, but there's a little bit of infatuation there, I think, you know, and fascination.
Yeah, you actually very early on, you know, specified they are not in a relationship. Right. You know, that was very important for you. But what is that dynamic then? Who has more power in the friendship?
Right. Well, I think it's one of those things where outwardly Richard does, because it's Richard's band, you know, Richard's calling the shots. Virgil is working for Richard. And you get the sense that Virgil has always, at some level, worked for Richard, even when they were little kids, you know what I mean? But here's the thing, I think that Richard really depends on Virgil. And Richard has not had a lot of stability in his life. He hasn't had a lot of people he can depend on, and including being, you know, kind of this budding rock star. He's got a lot of people sort of fawning over him and, you know, who are looking up to him, but he doesn't have a lot of no-nonsense, just friends, you know? So, and I think that probably happens with people who get famous like that. Like they reach back into their older friendships and they go, you were friends with me before I was this person, so I can trust you more. So I think, interestingly, maybe Richard depends on Virgil even more than Virgil would depend on Richard, but Richard's calling the shots on the day-to-day basis.
Yeah, I was actually curious about like the, you know, symbolism behind the merch table. At some point you say it's where fantasy meets reality. So what is this? What does the merch table mean? What is the symbolism there?
Yeah, well, I think the merch table, it's an interesting phenomenon. So for those who don't know, when bands, we'll just leave it at the band level, when bands are playing in clubs and things like that, they always have something called a merch table. And that's where you can go and you can buy maybe their music, or you can buy the t-shirt, you can buy the sticker, you can sign up for their mailing lists and things like that. And in a way, it's kind of like the middle ground between the band and the fans, because the person working the merch table is probably working for the band, they're affiliated with the band, they're probably traveling with the band and so forth, as Virgil is in the book. So they're kind of in the band, but they're really not exactly in the band. And so for fans, it's like who can't get to the band, it's a little bit like of a midway point, you know? And so the person who works the merch table also finds themselves being a representative of the band and maybe answering questions about the band. So I'm always fascinated. I like to talk to the merch table people because, you know, and I've written different books about rock bands and so forth, a lot of nonfiction about rock bands. And I always have the most admiration for the people who work things like the merch table or work the crew or roadies, because they work their tails off and they do all these different things to make sure the music gets on, but nobody's clapping for them. You know, nobody's fawning over them. They're just like, time to break down the equipment and get to the next gig. So I love those people, you know, because without them, the music doesn't get to us.
Right.
Speaking of the music, the band Laverna, the name, you mentioned her several times that she's a Roman goddess, correct? And just there's a lot of symbolism behind that. Could you go into why Laverna?
Yeah, so I always, and I will say I'd used different gods and goddesses before I landed on Laverna as the name of the band. But I like the idea that a lot of the gods and goddesses, especially from like Greek mythology, are very flawed. And they're very human. And so we're used to thinking of gods as often infallible and so massive and things. And the Greek gods and goddesses were not like that. You know, they mingled with humans. They often had major, like, you know, issues. I mean, they were really flawed. And they would take it out on humans just when they would sort of lash out and things like that. So Laverna was one of those characters, one of those goddesses that I thought was really fascinating, because sometimes they were even shunned and they were sort of like looked down on as Laverna was, but at the same time they were deities. So I like the complexity of that, and also the crossover with rock musicians who we sort of look up to, and they're kind of deities, but often massively flawed. Yeah. So I thought that they were the sort of perfect stand-in for the rock music dynamic.
Do you think Richard almost reflects a godlike presence sometimes, especially with the cult following, Julius in love with him, his best friend basically following him around like a puppy their entire lives?
Yeah, oh, absolutely, yeah. And I think, you know, to me, so when I was writing the book, I was looking at, and I would go back and watch videos and stuff like that of like Jim Morrison or Iggy Pop or Mick Jagger, some of my favorite frontmen who do, or Perry Farrell. Perry Farrell is a big one from Jane's Addiction. They transcend who they are walking up and down the street in day-to-day life when they're on the stage. They do transform into something that's almost mythical. And the energy that they move, the people that they move, what they convey is extremely powerful. And it's much more so than if they were just sort of sitting in this chair and talking to you. Well, you put those people up on stage and everything, and everybody around them gets transformed. And I do think there's something really magical about that.
So were you inspired by your own experiences of like going to shows? Were you a roadie yourself? Like, how did the idea for Merch Table Blues come about?
Yeah, that's it. So I am a Deadhead. I followed the Grateful Dead for years. My first real book was called Growing Up Dead, The Hallucinated Confessions of a Teenage Deadhead. So I have been going to concerts, you know, as long as I could just first get into them. And music has always been incredibly important to me. And I've traveled around the country, you know, with just following music and things like that. And I play music, and I've played in bands before. So, you know, yeah, that's a lot of my background. But for this book in particular, I used to go to a lot of shows that were sort of more local and more in the clubs, as opposed to going to like an arena or something like that. And to me, that's where a lot of them, like, most exciting energy is. Because you can see a band that maybe they're going to go to that next level and maybe not, and what does it take to get there and so forth. And because I come out of this Grateful Dead Deadhead scene, everybody would always say, well, it's a cult following, right? If you're a Deadhead, and people would think like, maybe it is a cult, you know? And that was really, that simple question is what drove the book. Like, what if a band with a cult following actually had a cult following?
Well, then what's the difference between devotion, loving the band, and obsession?
Right.
Cult-like.
Absolutely, yeah. And that is a question that the book has to wrangle with, you know? And I think in some ways, like, I would almost be giving away the ending if I answered that question. But let me just say, that is a big question in the book, you know? And I think we have examples where people have sort of, those lines have gotten blurred, you know, and crossed over, and it's gotten confusing for people. But Yeah. I mean, it gets into the nature of fame too, you know, and what is fame and who are these people and how do they ascend to this level that we look to them for all sorts of things beyond what they just do, which is make music.
Now, go ahead.
No, I mean, I was just going to ask based on that, then what do you hope people take away from the book?
Yeah.
My exact question.
Yeah. Well, I'll be honest. I think, you know, to me, it's just a fun book in a lot of ways. Like, I hope they're entertained by it. Honestly, I hope they get a kick out of it. I hope they get sucked in by the characters. I hope it's, you know, there's escapism to it and that they just enjoy the read. But if there's anything that sort of, I think you can pull out and really reflect and maybe like, you know, learn on or reflect on in that way, I do think it's the relationships between them. And in a lot of ways, to me, like great writing always comes down to those human relationships, you know, and seeing how people react to each other in different situations and what motivates them and drives them. So hopefully it, you know, asks some of those questions and delves into them some in ways that people can walk away and think more about it, maybe even in their own lives.
Is the goal to romanticize, right, sex, drugs, rock and roll, or is it more of a warning?
Yeah. Well, that's a good question. I mean, I think, so let me say this. I'm sober, so I don't do anything like that. But it's always been a part of that sort of mythology of rock and roll, right? So that's where it comes from. And I think, if anything, in this, there's a little of demystifying that, because the truth is all of that stuff tends to like get in the way of the art. You know, eventually it starts out as something that pulls musicians in and it's sort of romantic and things like that. Eventually it's usually the source of their demise as well. And I think we see that in the book too. You know, you see the sort of, yeah, at some level, the glorification of that and so forth. And then you see how it starts to rip relationships apart, and ultimately it undoes bands as well. You know, some of the best bands in the world have been pulled apart by sex, drugs, and it destroyed their rock and roll.
Now, these characters, they all have very diverse personalities. Each one has something of their own. Personally, my favorite character was Papa. I loved Papa so much. Is there any character in particular that you relate to yourself?
Yeah, I love Papa too, by the way. Yeah. And he's the bass player, and there's just something about bass players. They're just great. You know, they tend to be like quieter and they're sort of off to the side. Sometimes they wear sunglasses and don't make eye contact. And so that's, you know, Papa is sort of like that. He's a very stable character, and that's, you know, where the name comes from too, Papa. I wanted him to convey that. But for me, I mean, Virgil is the character that I relate to the most. And in some ways, so the book is also told in the first person, which means it's told through what Virgil sees only. So it's I did this and I did that and so forth. And he's an observer, you know, so he's getting into a situation that is unfamiliar to him, which is this whole rock scene and being on tour and so forth. And we're seeing and experiencing it all for the first time through Virgil's eyes. And in a lot of ways, that's what writers do. You know, we go through the world and we're checking it out and we're trying to translate that and explain it to other people. So Virgil is very close to my heart for sure.
Well, is he running away from something or is he running towards something? Is he trying to, you know, find himself by going with Richard, or is he just escaping school?
Yeah, I think of him as running towards something. I don't think about it as escapism as much as he's trying to figure himself out. And he's trying to have some experiences. And I think especially as a young artist, he's trying to like just be in the world, you know? And he comes from a smaller sort of city and hasn't been out in the world much. And I think when he starts to do his own writing, he feels that. So he feels like if he goes out and he does these things and he starts to travel and meet strange people and have strange experiences, that will feed into his writing more, and it ultimately does.
Yeah.
Well, what's your writing style? I'm curious. I had a professor once who was like, you have to write suddenly that lint you saw in the middle of nowhere. It's really important to clear it out. How are you?
Well, so for me, this was my first real experience with first-person fiction writing. So it was interesting to sort of not have to worry about getting into the consciousness of other characters when you're writing in third person, let's say, I'm going to have to describe what you're thinking and you're thinking and you're thinking. And this was really just, this is what Virgil sees. And it has its limitations because I can't investigate other people's, thoughts as much. But it's also kind of fun to just let it rip in that direction, and just run with it. So, yeah, the other thing I really try and do is be aware of all our senses. So when you're writing, the instinct is to just write what you see because we take in most of our information through our vision. But if you're really writing something, you want somebody to feel it, you think about like the way that your grandmother's kitchen smelled or your parents' kitchen or whatever it might be. All of these different senses come in and they create this full experience of actually being in that setting. So I really try and be aware of that too, how to bring readers in as much as possible and make them feel like they're in that club or in that space, in that car traveling city to city.
Yeah, and tell us your story. How did you get into writing to begin with?
Yeah, well, it's something that I always loved. I grew up reading and I read voraciously from the time I could, was a little kid. And so reading and writing was always something that I loved, that I was passionate about. And in high school, I started to just do it on my own. It was always connected to school. And then I just thought, well, I can just do this, And at a certain point, I was in English class in high school. I went to Pittsford Sutherland High School. And I was reading a book, and I just had this epiphany of like, oh, a person wrote this thing, because at a certain level you're handed books. It's almost like they come down from heaven and they just appear. And I had this thought of like, I like to put words on a page, and so do these people, and eventually it could be in this form and people could read it. And it sounds silly, but everything just fell into place. And really from that point on, I was committed to becoming a writer. But it's hard. It's hard to make a living as a writer. It's a tough profession. So I've been fortunate enough to serve as executive director and publisher of a publishing house called BOA Editions in Rochester. We've been around for 50 years. And so I publish and work on other people's books too. So my whole life, when I'm not doing my own writing, I'm publishing other people's writing and working with BOA. So I'm really fortunate to have been able to carve out a life in books, writing, and letters here in Rochester, New York.
Speaking of Rochester, this book has so many themes of northern New York. It goes actually not even northern New York, it goes all throughout.
Yeah.
How was it writing about basically your home?
Yeah.
It was really fun. The scene that everything sort of concludes at is at a club in Rochester. And when I was growing up, it was called the Warehouse, and then it was called like the Horizontal Boogie Bar. I honestly lost track of what it's called now. Oh, it's Water Street Music Hall now.
I was wondering if
Yeah.
it was still like a music venue to this day.
It is. It's Water Street Music Hall, and there's like a whole like alley that runs behind it that you go in backstage through, that I've spent a lot of time in that little area of it. And that's actually where the whole thing culminates. But I have been to all of these different places over and over and over, driven through them. I've gone to see music at all these places. Most of them I've been, for one reason or another, backstage or on stage at them too. So it was really familiar stuff for me. And that was part of the fun of writing it in the first person, is because I could just describe it as I had seen it, using Virgil as my stand-in. I love this area. I love the area. I love, there's a certain like heaviness and grayness. We're really in it now, in November. There's sort of a gray feeling to it, a color that I associate with it. And right now we're in that section of time where it's kind of cool and like the leaves are on the trees and they're colorful, but they're falling. Like I love that stuff, And there's a lot of poetry to it too,
Yes.
if you start to look at it that way. So I had a lot of fun writing about this area.
Yeah, it definitely felt like a love letter, right? Just in the first
Yeah.
2 pages, you mentioned Troy, you mentioned Utica, you mentioned Rochester. So you mentioned a bunch of places just early on. Is that just you taking from your own experience, or was it really important to you just to highlight our region?
Yeah, well, both. I mean, I do love this area, and I do want to share with other people what I love about it, and those are some of the things. And I also think it's fascinating that all of those names, or most of the names you just mentioned, are taken from the Greek, or from Greek cities. Troy, Utica, Virgil is, so there's a lot, once you start to pull it apart, a lot of the names and even the places that I refer to are taken from Greek mythology. So it sort of stitched the book together. And I always thought that was kind of interesting that we've taken so much from those places.
As I see, speaking of different places in the book, I know there was a point where it mentions that Richard went to Cortland. My assumption was SUNY Cortland. And that's where he met Felix, or was it Calvin, I think he knew him as. Can you explain more about their relationship and how that kind of came to be? Because I was trying to find a little bit more of a connection. He was like, oh, this is just somebody that just like follows me around. But
Right.
It was
yeah.
deeper than
So
that.
they go to Oneonta.
Oneonta.
Yeah, and they do meet there, and it's really interesting, and this might be jumping ahead to another question you have, but I'm actually writing a prequel to this book now
Oh.
that delves into who Felix is, where he came from, like going back to his childhood. Felix is the cult leader, and he's featured prominently in the book, but has very little space, and we don't really get to know how he thinks because it's first person.
Yeah.
So I touch on, how they got together, and basically that's the town that Felix is from, and where Richard went to school. And Richard, even though he was a college student, he was playing in bands, he was already sort of becoming this mythological Richard, and he already had the charisma, and all that stuff that he carries with him now. So Felix was a sort of lost soul, and just in many ways, like Virgil, attached himself to Richard. And one of the things that I had fun with was, what's the difference between Felix and Virgil? They're both kind of obsessed with Richard
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
different ways, but one has a really dark bend to his obsession, and one is, I think, using Richard as a way to sort of find who he is
Yeah.
in life. But they're both very fixated on Richard as a character.
My other question was kind of jumping off of that was, you kind of answered it a little bit, but like, was there a world where you envisioned that Richard was a lot more involved in this cult-like following that Felix had like created, and just like his business and how that kind of evolved?
Yeah, it's a really central question to the book, is how much does Richard know, and how much is he condoning, and why?
Yeah.
I think Richard is a really ambitious artist. He wants to get a following, and he's got this group that is literally following him from show to show. They're obsessed with his music, they're dancing, so wherever he goes, he's got an audience that's coming with him. So he's benefiting greatly from this following, but it's also pretty clear that there's like some funny business going on with this cult, and that it's not all above board. And it's never particularly clear until we get to the end what the cult is all about, or even that, it's a cult, as we say, and not just people who are fans. I think Richard knows more than he wants to acknowledge, and he's benefiting enough that he's going to kind of like look away from some of the darker stuff that starts to appear until it gets to the point where he can't look away anymore.
You just mentioned writing a prequel, so you obviously had questions yourself,
Yeah.
right? You wrote something very specific. What made you want to make that prequel?
Yeah, well, it was really, I will say, and this is going to sound kind of hokey, but I felt like Felix kept like tapping me on the shoulder, like, tell my story. Because, as I said, he is a character, he's a really central character in this book, but he doesn't get a lot of space and time because of, the way that the book is written. So I felt like he really was almost like demanding, like, tell my story. Tell where I came from, tell how I became who I am, and tell about the origins of the cult. And I will tell you something fun, which is, as I've been writing the book, there's a lot about the cult that I didn't realize, including some really central differences about who's actually leading the cult.
Okay.
And there are characters who don't appear in this book who are really kind of pulling the strings on the cult that we don't see.
Interesting.
So
Yeah, right.
I don't want to give away too much, but that's part of the fun of writing. It's like, I didn't even know that, and all of a sudden this character just appeared from his childhood and became an incredibly important figure in the book I'm working on, and is now, when I read this, completely behind this whole thing too.
Well, that brings me to, what advice would you give young writers, people who have that ambition?
Yeah, I think it is important to go out and talk to people, to see some new places, and to take some chances and try and expand your worldview as much as possible. We all have places where we grew up and we're sort of grounded in, and that's wonderful. You need to use that to grow from, but then do grow. Do go out and talk to different people and get in some situations that are uncomfortable, and then go back and write about it, and write and write and write, and read and read and read. That's the only way you can become a writer.
Well, that's perfect to our rapid fire questions. We have a few for you. I did not want to prepare you for this very, very intentionally. Let's try to make them rapid fire, okay?
Okay.
Do your best
I will.
here. Number one, what is your favorite genre to read?
Nonfiction.
Okay, favorite genre to write?
Fiction right now.
Ooh.
How many books do you read a month?
I read hundreds of manuscripts a year. Most
Okay.
of them not published because of my job.
Okay, so sorry, a rapid fire question that I've added here. How many do you read for your own personal enjoyment?
I read probably 30 books a year.
Do you have a writing superstition? And what is it?
I don't.
You don't?
No.
Wow, okay.
Yeah.
Cats or dogs?
Dogs now.
Dogs
I was cat for years, and I got allergic to cats, and now I have a dog that I absolutely adore named Lilu. Hi, Lilu.
What's a book you wish more people knew about?
Merch Table Blues.
What's one quote you love?
Let there be songs to fill the air.
What emotion did you feel writing this book?
I felt joy. Yeah, I felt joy.
I like it, joy. And, you know, tell us what you have going on right now. You're obviously writing a prequel, but what else do you have going on?
Yeah, so the big thing that I'm working with creatively is the prequel to this, which is currently called Cult Following, and also the history of the All. The All is the name of the cult. So I'm doing that, and also, as I mentioned, I'm executive director of BOA Editions here in Rochester, and we have our 50th anniversary coming up. So I'm doing everything I can to spread the word on BOA's place in Rochester and our cultural community, and yeah, so between those two things, it keeps me busy.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us. It was a
Yes,
pleasure.
thank you.
I know you guys love this discussion. Like I mentioned earlier, we've been trying not to talk about the book. It's been really difficult, and now we finally got to do it. So thank you very much for joining us. We will announce our next read on News 8's X and Facebook pages on Wednesday at noon. Have a great read.
Get the Rochester First streaming app today for everything you love from News 8 On Demand, plus exclusive shows you won't see anywhere else. Search ROC and download for free on Roku, Amazon Fire, and Apple TV.